Booknerds, welcome to another session where we have with us another awesome author. And today with us, it's the author of this book, Masala Lab. And I mean, it's an experiment. It's a damn experiment. You should read it. And I'm not even using the word as a pun because, I picked up Krish. First of all, welcome to the session. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you. Thank
joining
you.
us. And before I tell everybody more about you, I would like to ask you what happened. Eureka. I mean, it's kind of the words that came to my head while reading this one. I mean, how sane and how ridiculous this book is at the same time. I'm so sorry. They were the two words that were coming to my head, and I was so split in my head.
So just thank you, and I'll take that as a compliment because see, I think in general, I felt that uh, Indian cooking deserved the scientific treatment
Yeah.
in the sense of. If not for its own sake, but really targeting people who kind of want to get better at it, or start learning a little bit more in deep about cooking, right? And so that's the primary reason I thought, and I saw that there was no book on the food science of the Indian kitchen.
Yeah.
A lot of food writing is either history or culture or anthropology, or just mostly recipes based on recipes. And I think you know what, maybe that's not the way to.
Yeah.
I don't think our grandmothers cooked with recipes or
Oh yes.
and
Yes.
so on. So for most part, I think the idea was to say, is there a way I can capture some of those heuristics, some of the ways in which you kind of make food delicious. What you would consider rules of sort of general rules of thumb. But yes, I mean they've been handed over, over the generations.
Right.
But I think but they've never been documented and tested and A/B tested, and saying, hey, which of these are actually, hey, what, backed by science, and which of these are not.
Yeah.
And the surprising discovery is that most of the stuff that your grandmother does, the science checks out. Random things you find on the internet and WhatsApp forwards about turmeric and other things, they don't check out, right? So I think so. That was the original intent of really writing this book.
Okay. For those of you who don't know about Krish Ashok, he has juggled a lot, and I was like, what? Can he do all of those things together? So he's a Twitter star. Go to his Twitter channel, and I'll leave it in the description. Especially, do check it out. Plus, he's a musician. He plays the violin of all instruments, and people call him a humorist. So that as well. And finally, of course, you are experimenting with cooking for a while, I believe, because it's impossible to come up with this without doing that. And this book has come up now. What's happening, Krish? I mean, where is this all going?
I mean, to be, yes. I mean, I'll be candid. I did not think that the first book I will write will be about would have been about cooking. If you had told me 5 years ago that I'd
And I
write a book
forgot,
about
and I
cooking,
forgot you are an IT guy. I mean, the most important thing, I think that pays the bills, of course.
yeah, pretty much. So I mean, I wouldn't have predicted this per se. In fact, it wasn't even my first proposal to Penguin.
Yeah.
I mean, I was obviously trying a couple of other things from a book idea standpoint.
Right.
As someone who's been writing humor and science for a while,
Right.
I thought maybe science fiction, humorous science fiction, was perhaps the first
Oh
thing that
yes,
I will.
that
Uh,
would have been a great book as well. Why not?
so actually, I wrote down uh, detailed summaries of 6 or 7 short stories on this sort of near-term science fiction, like looking at the intersection of, say, you know, funny intersections of things like caste and so on, but with a sci-fi sort of a mindset and things like that. So that was what was my
It sounds
one of the
it
proposals I
sounds totally bonkers. Are there any ideas which are not bonkers coming from your head?
so,
Yeah.
but then but Penguin wanted a nonfiction sort of proposal as well. Again, keeping in mind that as someone with who's written for newspapers and magazines for the last 15 years or so, largely on nonfiction, largely obviously on science and technology and those kinds of issues, right? And it kind of made sense that it had to be nonfiction. And then I said, okay, fine. You know what? I can either write about music or I can write about cooking. Those are the two things that I absolutely love. And I kind of realized that it was one, it's hard to write about music
Right.
because music is its own language, right? And writing about music takes an extraordinary skill, which some people have. But then again, because music is its own language and it communicates its own thing,
Right.
writing about music is just is did not seem that appealing to me.
But I suppose,
I would rather, yeah,
but
I would rather just play the music, right? I mean, rather than write
of
about it.
course, but I suppose that could have been an interesting, thing also, because even in music, there are books, but there aren't that many that are doing great service, especially in India. I mean, just like
That's true. Yeah.
Masala Lab. I mean, you're right in the introduction also that a lot of it has become. I mean, it's oral, so it's kind of
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
disservice to cooking, perhaps. So
Exactly. Yeah.
my first question to you was that you have mentioned, I don't know how to pronounce this, but kai manam, is it
Kaibanam. Yes.
kai manam?
Yes.
So people who can conjure great food, of course, and they
Yeah.
have that,
The flavor in their hands. I mean, it's
yes,
literally hand flavor, right?
yeah, hand flavor, and
Yes.
and that's such a huge thing across India. So I mean, the book goes completely against that, because you are trying to build up this algorithm, and multiple algorithms, so that it becomes easier for people like us who picked up cooking during the pandemic, and we are just figuring it out. I mean, the
Yeah.
balance,
Yeah.
it's quite confusing when you learn cooking from your mom or perhaps your wife. It gets very confusing, and coming from a technical background, it's totally, I get screwed up in the head. So has that happened to you also?
Well, no, so I mean, I've been cooking since I was almost 13 or 14 years old. So,
Wow.
by sort of, by my mom also used to work, and so she used to travel once in a while. So that's when I started cooking. Um, and so for me, obviously, in the early days, it did seem like this whole it's this mystical thing, and somehow
Right.
some people have it and some people don't have it, right? And I think as I kind of got better over the years, my aim was not to then turn back on others and say, "Oh, it's an art," and now either you get it or you don't get it. And I said, being the engineer I am, that you really have to look. So there are things that are there. There is art, but there is also craft, and craft needs documentation, right? So what some people might say, "Kai badam" and hand flavor. Oh, you just have this sense, etc.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's just simple chemistry,
Right.
right? And if you look at it deeply enough, there is a simple science to it, and it's not all that complicated at all, right? The idea is to say, can I capture the net sum of some of those basic principles in a 200-page book,
Right.
as opposed to say a 700-page academic tome?
Yeah.
Can it be a simple, easy, breezy reading
Right.
sort of
But
thing that kind
I
of
actually,
captures the essence of
sorry.
the whole thing?
Yeah, but I actually like the way you broke it down for everyone, because I mean, if I were not an engineering student, I mean, in my previous life, I say that in my previous life, but I understood everything easily. It was quite easily broken down, but that's a task in itself, because
Yes.
I mean, you need to be a great teacher to do that, or you would have researched it so well so that you could broke it down to the minimum. So how was that process? And of course, we'll talk about uh, Penguin, of course, because they have
Sure.
published the book. And how did that process work out with your editor?
Sure. Yeah. So obviously, I mean, as I love teaching, so and for a long time I've been the person in the family to explain science to kids. Typically, I'm usually the one who's called to
I was
both,
wondering. I was
to either
wondering. I was wondering where is that coming from, because you broke it down beautifully, and I'm not just saying it for the sake of it, because I think a lot of teachers need to learn. They should read the book and try to do that, inculcate that, I suppose.
No, absolutely. So I love teaching. So to the two categories of people I've always been asked to explain things to are kids and then really old people. And so I kind of like the challenge of being able to explain using first principles, right? As opposed to, so normally a lot of teachers and a lot of people who give explanations, right? Uh, they tend to assume that you have a certain base level of knowledge,
Yes.
and so that therefore I can rise above that and then use that as your base and so on. And here I didn't want to do that, and I said, no, you know what? At the end of the day, my reader may not have studied physics or
Oh,
chemistry
yes.
at a high school level, right? They may be art students. They may be people from entirely different backgrounds. Um, and so therefore the science has to be accessible. The science has to be very first principles, right? In a way, it does help, yes, if you remember some of these things from your high school, but it's absolutely not required at all, right? Which is why we even went ahead and said, you know what, let's not try and put a glossary, because if I put a glossary, then I will use those terms and say, you please refer to the glossary. And I think I felt that to be lazy.
Oh,
I
yes.
said, you know what, no, if I'm saying something about heat transfer, I really have to go right down to the atoms and molecules and say this is exactly what's happening.
I was actually expecting a glossary, and then it wasn't there. Anyway, so because there were certain terminology, perhaps no, actually, I mean it was pretty simple. So I congratulate you on that. Um, the one thing I have done in this entire lockdown period, and I have watched a lot of YouTube cooking videos. Okay, I mean I have
Yes.
just killed YouTube. so and so what's your opinion on that? Because a lot of good chefs, great,
Yeah.
um,
Sure.
uh, I mean I would say they are good at their art and they
Oh
are
yeah,
doing
absolutely.
this.
Yeah.
So what's
Yeah.
your opinion on this entire scenario? I mean, putting the book in perspective, of
Sure,
course.
sure, sure. So, in fact, clearly, um, there is no dearth of cooking content, and amazing cooking content, right? And clearly the pandemic has clearly brought that to the fore, and it has made it easy for people to access a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
So you can watch some really great cooks and some really great chefs, and you watch it enough number of times, you watch enough variations, and you kind of get a sense for why what they're doing and so on. But then again, my foundation problem was always the fact that uh, it's not a great way to learn the principles
Right.
by looking at recipes. And I think, and I often find that even a lot of the YouTube guys, they probably make tremendously delicious food, but they are not quite expert at explaining why what they do works,
Right.
or more importantly, here's what you should not do, or here is this specific step matters more than something else,
Yeah.
right? And recipes have a way of telling you that no, everything is important, follow exact this precise
Right.
step and so on,
Right.
but it's not really necessary, right? Most cooks don't need to follow those line by line, but it's better for you to break it down into bigger chunks of principles, right? I mean, I'm blooming spices in fat. I'm actually sort of thickening this gravy, or I'm making a rice based dish, or I'm making a wheat based dish. And then those broader algorithms are actually easier for people to pick up. So that was the context. As someone who essentially has watched more hours of YouTube cooking content than anyone else on the planet in the
Right.
last decade,
Right.
right? Not just the pandemic, right?
Of course.
Just to even research the book, right?
Yes.
I saw a
We need it
tremendous
actually
amount of.
because it's very easy to go wrong with this. I mean, because there are so many people who are good at this, and then you have to know everything. Great work, seriously. And this is going to be my guide to everything because I am seriously confused because I have watched so many YouTube videos. I have
Yes.
asked other people, I have asked for advice, and this I talked to Veer Sangvi earlier this year, and of course that was a very historical sort of
Yeah.
experience, and
Yes.
because he does that really well. And but this is something like totally crazy. Like I watched Queen's Gambit recently, and it's like that, out of the blue, you are hit by it. So thank you for that. Let's talk about. I was reading page 35, and this is the chapter zero pressure cooking, and you are talking about cooking rice, and you have made a reference to Ayn Rand, especially. I mean, for dummies like me. So, uh, what is it about rice? I mean, we all know how to cook it, but to
Yeah,
do it just right. I mean, of course, we
yeah,
don't have to give all everything to the people who
yeah,
are
yeah.
watching us, but a little bit,
Sure.
some.
See, rice is, in fact, I start off with pressure cooking and rice because I think it is the most, it is the most common staple food in this part of the world, right? And rice is one of those magical things, right? So if you, on the one hand, right, you can cook such large amounts for a big family in one shot,
Yeah.
and while that's happening, you can do other things. It's not
Right.
like chapati where it's linear. You have to do it one after another, and it takes very time consuming, right? Rice is that fantastic thing that where you can make either a biryani or a plain sort of rice in its own time, and you can parallelly do other things. And so obviously, I think uh, rice is one of those things that a lot of people have a common misconception about for two reasons. One related to the rice, the other related to pressure cooking. Okay. So what is related to the rice is the beginners have this fear of estimating water for rice,
Yeah.
right? Because the problem is that estimating by ratios is actually the wrong way to do it.
Okay.
Because rice absorbs 1 cup of rice, absorbs 1 cup of water. That's it.
Okay.
And you would think, then why do we add more than 1 cup of water?
Yeah.
It's to account for evaporation,
Right.
right? Because some of that water is actually going to get evaporated as you heat it.
Yeah.
And so you need to account for that. How do you account for that?
Yeah.
Has to do with the physics of the vessel. It has nothing to do with ratios at all.
True.
Okay.
True.
And so typically at a certain level of heat, sim or medium or whatever it is, and a certain size of pan, you need to add a little bit more additional water, which either works out to a 1.5 cups or 1:2 cups at small volumes.
Yes.
But if you try to make 3 cups of rice and if you add 6 cups of water, you'll get khichdi, right?
Yeah. Truly.
And so for 3 cups of rice, you actually need only 3.5 or 4 cups of water, right?
Yeah.
Now, the thing is that one is understanding that. Okay. The second thing is that people additionally sort of make this common error of measuring pressure cooking in whistles. And
Yeah.
literally all
Yeah.
cookbooks and all YouTube content will tell you that
Every.
measure in whistles.
Yes.
Um, and it's wrong because if you the frequency with which you get the whistles
Yeah.
will vary depending on whether you're using a gas flame or an induction stove.
Yeah.
And if you use an induction stove, the whistles come really, really fast and your rice will be undercooked
Right.
because it's the amount of time that the rice spends at peak pressure
Hmm.
after the first whistle that matters.
Right.
It's not the number of whistles at all, right? And so I think, I think these were like the two starting sort of things that I thought I'd, begin the whole thing with.
Goodness, this is all great for me. Anyway, so were you surprised when you were researching this book? Of course, that there are no books like this in India. I don't think so. There are. Perhaps in the
Both
West.
yes and no, right? I mean, uh, as a society, uh, we're not really one for craft, right?
Right.
Lots of books about art, but not really craft, right? I mean, we don't like de-romanticizing things that can be romanticized.
Oh yes, of course.
And cooking is one of those things, right? So there are 400 billion cookbooks about, the Nawabi cooking or the
True.
Mughlai cooking or the Malabar cooking or, and all of those things. But not surprisingly, no books about basics of Indian sort of food science. And obviously, as someone who's consumed food science books for about Western cooking,
Okay.
right, like Food Lab and
Yeah.
on the lore of the kitchen and so on. Those were my inspirations of saying that hey, there needs to be something like this for Indian cooking, right? Uh, yes, many of the same science principles apply, but the typical day-to-day Indian cooking is not about baking pizzas, making pastas, and the usual kinds of things that the food science books in the West tend to talk about, right? So I said, okay, I want to write a food science book that kind of talks about baking rice, making chapati, sort of cooking dal, cooking eggs, and cooking meat, and the kinds of things that you can describe as generally happening, the Indian kitchen.
Yeah.
So that was the
So you talk about developing a community of food science enthusiasts in the. I mean, in the future. Uh, what do you mean by that? Can you elaborate? How is that going to happen? Or perhaps you have seen that it can happen. How is
Very
the
much.
interest like?
So in the sense, the my Twitter community is largely this. Okay.
Okay, okay, okay.
In a sense of people who over time have kind of built a common vocabulary, right? So that's part of the problem, right? A lot of Indian cooking, in order to be able to document it like a craft, you need a common, easily understandable vocabulary,
Right.
right? If everyone uses different terms or uses terms that really don't make sense, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
You know, cook till the raw smell of tamarind goes away is a very common instruction.
Yes.
It's not a great instruction because you can't actually describe what raw tamarind smells like in words. How do you see, from the point of view of someone who's trying to write down knowledge, right? The way you write down and represent knowledge is important. And so therefore, saying that cook the tamarind till it tastes as less sour as you like it, uh,
Right.
is a more accurate way of really thinking about it, because one, you're saying that one, at the end of the day, tamarind is an acid and so it will
Yeah.
taste sour. uh, how sour do you want your dish to be? Is You are the best judge, you keep tasting it, and when it is just as sour as you like it, you stop cooking, right? So that's a better instruction than saying, cook it till the raw smell of tamarind goes away. But nobody knows what raw tamarind smells like versus say cooked tamarind smells like, right?
When you say it
so
like
so
that,
it's
it
just
sounds pretty vague because
exactly
that's where the problem lies for especially dummies like me. I mean, we don't understand all this. I mean, we want really straight instructions which we can follow.
right.
And what
Exactly.
happens is when we go to different sources, it gets all screwed up. So that's
Right.
the
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah. See,
Um,
the other thing also is that you have to be able to use language that is unambiguous,
right.
right? In the sense of, uh, using smells as a guide is very bad, right? Especially because you can't write it down, you can't describe smells, right? So that's the thing. It's happening only in your nose. On the other hand, it's easier to describe visual cues, right? So it's easier to say when the onions are golden brown, right? Or when it's a specific shade of, but not dark brown enough,
Right.
and so on, right? You can also describe textures, and so on. So it's important that when you actually describe and teach things to people, that you don't just rely on smell,
Agree.
you have, or taste, because you can't actually describe it when you write about it. But it's much easier to describe an actual visual outcome or actual textures,
True.
and so on, because that's easier for us to translate from word to some things, that we can understand.
True. Let's talk about your kitchen. I What I could visualize was a science laboratory. Okay, but
Yeah.
because you had mentioned so many equipment, and what's happening there? Isn't your family like kind of psyched out by this? What's happening in the kitchen?
No, so I mean,
Let's talk about the
it's
apparatus.
right,
I should
right.
say
So
apparatus.
it's yeah. So it's actually it's a regular kitchen for most part.
Okay.
I think the only things that I might use more commonly that people may not, is kitchen thermometers,
Okay.
a weighing scale, obviously an reasonably accurate weighing scale, so I kind of get a sense, and so on. And that's really pretty much it. I mean, I might use things like, say, an immersion blender,
Right.
and things like that. But really nothing out of the ordinary. And that was also one of the things, right? So while the lab part of the whole masala lab thing
Right.
is not for you to literally visualize an actual laboratory.
Yeah.
The lab part should be in your head. Right? The lab part is really about using the scientific method. It's about
Right.
saying that today, if I use 80% hydration for chapati and it turned out crisp,
Yeah.
it's documenting that and saying, tomorrow I'm going to use 90%.
Right.
And so in the spirit of experimentation, right? It's really about saying that I will not buy 200-gram dabbas of spice powders, which will oxidize in no time. And it's actually more commonsensical to buy whole spices and then grind the spices fresh.
Yeah.
using a coffee grinder
yeah.
or a spice grinder,
I love that
which I
actually when
yeah.
you where you have mentioned, and you have mentioned it multiple times so that
Oh
it
yes.
seeps in.
Oh
Because
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think it was deliberate because you really wanted everyone to make fresh spices. And
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a huge difference, right? Yeah. So if you go to a restaurant, trust me, a good restaurant will make all of those spices fresh. They're never going to use spice powders
yeah,
that we tend to buy, and then they kind of in the Indian climate,
yeah,
they're just going waste.
yeah, true. So let's talk about some myths. I mean, there are millions of myths that I've heard, that this and that in cooking, especially, and I mean, I get confused. Let's talk about some top like three myths what you have encountered and you have tried to bust through this
Sure.
book.
Yeah. So clearly, I think the pressure cooking by whistles was probably the one of the most common ones. And then the other one was so that was rice, right? So let's do wheat, which is probably the second most thing.
Yeah.
Um, that you have to knead chapati like
Yes,
really
yes,
really hard
yes,
to make it soft. You
yeah,
don't.
yeah,
Uh, uh, Gluten and gliadin proteins in water, if they just sit in water for about 20-25 minutes, they will knead themselves.
yeah,
In fact, if you observe your grandmother, she'll probably just mix the dough and let it sit for a while,
right, right,
and then you don't need to knead it much at all, right? So that's called autolysis. So
yeah,
the sense that dough tends to knead itself rather than you having to physically knead it. So that's I think another common misconception. I think then in the context of meat, there is this a common misconception that marination adds flavor to
yeah.
meat. It doesn't. And more importantly, the longer you marinate, the better the flavor.
Oh
Actually,
goodness,
no.
I mean, I have been doing this wrong for this entire year. Goodness. I'm
Sure.
going to do it right next time with the
Sure.
brine thing, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, yeah,
But
absolutely. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
I'm going to brine it.
Yeah.
But
And so yeah, but you should marinate it because I think it's good for the spices to get to stick to the surface. But half an hour is enough. You don't need like 24 hours and all of that. Yeah.
I did it overnight, like
Yeah.
5 to 6 times. So I screwed it all up. Anyway, so great learning for me. Anyways, so you have talked about the role of alcohol, and it's such a religious thing in India.
Yeah.
Most many parts in India, we avoid alcohol,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
in our food. I mean, we
Yes.
tend to
Yeah.
dance and kick people for it when the lockdown opens up. We love to do that, but not
Yeah.
enough food.
Yeah.
So
No. So that it's funny you say that. Actually, the as uh, there's always been a brewing tradition and a culture of actually using alcohol in cooking is not uncommon at all. I mean, you look at these slightly older recipes, the use of toddy, the use of fenny, and all of these local liquors in cooking was quite common. Like for example, my wife is from Kerala, right? And her grandmother would ferment appam, which is the sort of that concave dosa like thing.
okay,
Um, the fermentation used to happen by you adding kaldu, which is basically local toddy,
okay,
and that's what would ferment the toddy. Of course, nowadays they use baking a soda or baking powder instead. But the interesting thing is that it's a combination of historical these things and the British rule and so on that kind of killed a lot of the local brewing traditions. Because obviously, one of the things the British wanted to do was take control of
right,
the liquor supply in general,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so a lot of local brewing traditions really suffered
yeah,
as a result. And so it's in a sense that I think the fact that we are not using alcohol in our kitchens today
yeah,
is a relatively recent phenomenon.
okay,
It's a phenomenon like obviously controlled by the British, and obviously just the small narrow slice of puritanical upper caste Hindu sort of mindset of saying no alcohol and so
right,
on
right.
is a a relatively recent phenomenon.
Hmm. Okay. So, I mean, we have to talk about. I wanted to talk about the back and forth between the editor and you, because this must have been interesting. Was I mean, if the editor doesn't know anything about cooking,
Yes.
would have it mattered? I mean, I don't know if that happened.
Right.
Tell us a little bit
So,
about
so,
that.
so the great thing about the editing process of this was actually, fantastic. And this is something that my editor said that she thoroughly enjoyed this process of, almost a 3 to 4 month process of actually editing
Can you name it?
this book.
Can you name?
Um,
Yeah.
it is Aslesha from
Okay.
Penguin,
Okay.
right? And so the interesting thing is that let's take another book. Like so, let's take say a book about say uh, the history of a specific Maratha kingdom, or something like
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
Um, in a book like that, right? So the copy editor obviously has in addition to just the stylistic, the language, and making sure that the tenses are all in the right place, and they're not contradicting each other and so on. But the job of the editor is also to make sure that that you're not saying that this person killed this person here but saying something else somewhere else, right? So internally, consistency is also something that the person is constantly the person is checking for. But at the same time, right, the person writing is the expert in the subject.
Of course.
The person editing
Yeah.
is not,
Yeah.
right? And so at maximum, they can do a few fact checks here and there, but they can't challenge your academic
True.
credentials in a given area.
True.
In with this book, what was really fascinating, because of the style that I chose to write it, right, in the sense of, look, there is no science for science sake, right? It has to be in the service of something that you do in the kitchen, and there is no theory without practicals, right?
Right.
And so the great part was that my copy editor literally tried every single thing, be down to the cooking by whistles, down to use the try
Wow.
30-minute auto lease for the,
Right.
because at the end of the day, see, this is something that we do 2-3 times a day, right?
Yes.
uh, it should not be something fancy, right? Cooking should not be hard, right?
Yes.
And so therefore, what was good and what was fortunate for me is that I literally then had someone who was honestly able to test literally everything once, as an independent, this thing. And then sometimes say, hey, you know what? I tried this, and are you sure the 100% hydration, because the chapati ended up being too sticky? We really had those. So I think that was,
This is
that was genuinely helpful, right?
the most amazing interaction I've heard, and I have talked to so many authors, but this is the most
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
amazing.
it was fortunate for me, right? And it's a fortunate circumstance of this style that we decided to sort of take this book towards. If it was just all academic science and so on, then it would have been edited in a
Right.
sort of slightly more matter of fact way. I'll check a few things, but hey, you understand the science and I don't.
Yeah.
This, on the other hand, was no. I don't want to let the science get in the way of actually explaining what's actually going on,
Right.
right? And as a person who's she didn't come from a science background either,
Yeah.
and it was, so therefore it was the perfect
Oh, yes.
sort of
Yes. Actually, because
so I
it
said,
would have
look,
been.
you are exactly the kind of reader where
Yes.
this book is aimed at. So I think
True. Because
turned out perfectly.
if she were a science student, that would have been kind of, counterproductive, perhaps.
It would have, exactly. It would have been counterproductive, because that person is obviously then going to assume that they understand a
Yeah.
certain level of thing and skip past all of them and say, yeah, this
Yeah.
sounds about right, right?
Right. So, I, I mean, I have to talk about biryani because I was looking forward to the chapter, and for the past 2 days, I was just waiting for the biryani chapter. Okay, so I'm obsessed with biryani, and all
Who
Indians
isn't?
are. I
Yeah.
mean, who
Oh
isn't?
yes, yes.
So, and you have given very good algorithms, to be honest, and for all varieties. What's your favorite? First of all, you have to name one. That is
Yeah,
a
yeah,
compulsory thing.
yeah,
And which is the one you most like to cook? And
yeah.
of course, a little bit about the algorithms.
Sure. I mean, Kolkata is my favorite style per se.
Okay.
I think it's Kolkata is sort of like clearly a fusion between the Avadi style,
Yeah.
and it mixes a lot of other things. And I think for me, I think the use of potatoes is I think what really makes it. I know a lot of people have strong opinions about potatoes in
Oh
biryani,
yes.
but I think it especially if you're making mutton biryani particularly.
Yeah.
I'm not such a fan of potatoes in chicken biryani,
I
but
don't
mutton
think so. That
biryani
would
with
work
a
out.
ton of, yeah, the amount of flavors it has.
Right.
I think the potato is a perfect canvas to absorb
Okay.
a lot of those, and I think it's fantastic. Clearly, but it's I also find the Bengali style quite elaborate.
Okay.
So from a day-to-day cooking, I prefer the Hyderabadi style, I think it allows me to very easily just sort of work on the beat and marinate it and keep that aside and keep that ready, and sort of the whole thing comes together reasonably quickly. So that's what I tend to prefer. And also I like the milder flavor profile of
Okay.
the Hyderabadi style of biryani as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about the algorithm because it's quite, I mean, easy to understand, at least for me. Uh, let's see how I experiment with it. I apply it. But what were the things you needed to be careful about? Because this is a very sensitive topic.
Oh yes, yes,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, absolutely,
everybody
yeah.
is an expert in
Oh
biryani, and
yeah, yeah,
everybody is ordering it across
absolutely. It is.
across the board because I mean, a lot of new startups are selling biryani like anything, and
Yes,
even Domino's has gotten serious about it.
exactly. Yeah,
Imagine who imagined
yeah.
that. So
Dunkin' Donuts,
Dunkin'
Dunkin'
Donuts, goodness,
Dunkin' Donuts and Domino's getting together, starting a company called Ekdum to
it's
sell 99 rupee biryani. I mean, I think it's yeah,
it's mind-boggling
exactly,
actually.
mind-boggling. Yes, absolutely. I
So
mean, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, it is one of the subcontinent's great dishes, right?
yeah,
And at the end of the day, and people are very, and I kind of talk about this. And one of the things that you'll see me repeating again and again through the book is that please don't get obsessed about authenticity in food, right?
yes, yes,
Uh, if food is as authentic as what you make in your kitchen with the
right,
ingredients that you have,
right,
and your fondest memories of food are based on what your mother, your grandmothers made. And those nostalgia and those memories are what make that authentic for you, right?
yeah,
It by definition cannot be authentic for anyone else.
of course,
Right? It's literally how it works. And I think people tend to get needlessly worked up about, oh, this is biryani, veg biryani is not biryani, and all that nonsense, right? Um, so I think every biryani you can make biryani with what you have, right? I think the in general the common kinds of errors that people get nervous about, especially when making a biryani that seems quite complicated, is the real with biryani you have to realize it's not the meat and the that's the star of the show. The rice is the star of the show.
true, true,
Um, right? I mean, you would think that the what ginger garlic paste you use and what biryani masala you use, none of that actually matters.
right.
If you get the rice wrong, your biryani is a disaster,
So
regardless of what fancy saffron and whatever masalas you
I've
use.
done that.
And it's
I've done that.
right, and and getting the rice right for biryani is one of the slightly more trickier things, right?
Yeah,
So when you make steamed rice at the start of the book, right,
yeah,
that's essentially you want to get you're making rice that it's serving as a canvas for other things. You pour a gravy, you pour a chicken curry, you pour something else or a sambar, it's or a dal.
yeah,
It's a canvas, right? And you can if it's reasonably simple to get it right to the point
right,
where the rice is just fluffy and all of that.
yeah,
Making a pulao is slightly harder because you need to get the rice right and you only have one shot at it and you're making the whole thing in one shot, right? And so you need to estimate the water correctly and all the rest of that stuff.
yeah.
With biryani, the tricky thing is that you're going to cook the rice twice.
True.
And the chances of you overcooking it is much higher, right? And so people will tell you cook it to 75% done, cook it to 80% done. All of that is very hard to visualize, right? So but you
I
want to cook the
can't
rice.
figure it out for God's sake. I what is that? I mean, I really love the way I'm. I'm not just praising you here because I mean, but the temperatures that you have talked about, it
Yeah,
makes so much of sense. I can just know when to
exactly,
stop. That's about it.
exactly.
As simple as that. Why don't people talk like that? I have no idea.
It's so that's what I say. So I keep telling people that if there's one thing you want to take away from this entire book, right? If there's just one thing that will improve your cooking skills by the single biggest amount for the least amount of knowledge,
Yeah,
it's understanding temperatures.
true.
And so which is why all the places I'm like constantly saying that guys just keep the thermometer, right? Understand what's going on where, right?
Yeah,
Because what's happening is that around 65 Celsius is when meat starts cooking, right? Around 70 Celsius is when starches start cooking.
right,
100 Celsius your water boils. 110 is when onions start to brown,
right,
and you get all those brown colors. And 175 is when your puri is fried to a perfect crisp,
right,
sort of
right.
golden ball and so on.
Yeah,
And it's just that you understand these temperatures, and then you can well and truly not mess up things.
Right.
right? And I think, so with regard to rice for biryani, right?
Yeah.
It's really about making sure that the first time you cook it and you bite it, it's still raw inside.
Okay.
If it's not raw inside, you have already overcooked it.
Yeah.
And then you're probably going to get a slightly mushier biryani, and you can still salvage it if you really cook it at low heat,
Okay.
and so on. But so
But that's
that's
a
the whole.
hard task, I suppose. I mean,
It
that
is. It is.
once
It
it's
takes. It takes. Right, and it particularly made harder
yeah,
because basmati rice is notoriously unreliable
yeah.
from the point of view of every time, even buying from the same brand,
Wow.
the
The
second
difference.
batch of 1 kilo will work differently. It is
Okay.
just it's notorious. In fact,
That's very
I
sweet.
often, personally, outside of this thing, I'm like, basmati is like my least favorite variety of rice because it is so unpredictable. And in fact, in South India, there's another variety of rice that we use for biryani called siraka samba.
Okay.
And it is fantastic. It is as aromatic as basmati, and it is remarkably consistent. And it's it's much harder to mess up a biryani with that variety of
I
rice.
don't
And I
think
think
so. We
really
get it
people
up.
need to discover these non-basmati varieties of.
Yeah, I don't think so. It's here. I mean, in the north, I don't think I've not never heard about it. So
Yeah, no, it's a very specific South Indian
yeah,
variety of rice.
I'll
Yeah.
have to get it off Amazon, perhaps.
Yeah. Yes, yes. It's
So
actually a very small grain. It looks very small, but it's very fantastically even cooking and hard to mess up. Yeah.
wonderful. So I um, let's talk about reviews. I mean, first impressions. What have you heard from people? Because you are in the public domain. I mean, not all authors are so involved online, and you have been
Yep.
doing this for a while now. The online
Oh
thing.
yes.
And so, what happened when the book came out? What were the reviews that you? I mean, of course, all kinds of reviews are good for one to perhaps make sequels and etc. etc. So,
Yeah.
what were the reviews like initially?
No,
First
I think I was yeah, I mean, as someone who's been engaging with my audience for a while, in the process of obviously just writing this book itself, right?
right.
And so and then people have been sitting and pre-ordering it for months in advance.
Wonderful.
Um,
That's a
uh,
wonderful
and
feeling for an author. Actually, that's a wonderful feeling when you see
so
those
so in a
pre-orders.
sense, exactly. So I in a sense that compared to many other authors, I had a much sort of close relationship with what is it that people were expecting,
Right.
and what they were looking forward to in the book and so on, right? But I was still very pleasantly surprised
Okay.
that people had the sort of reaction that you had, which is that, oh wow, okay, I didn't
Because
expect
I
that
was
it
not,
would explain.
I didn't know about you previously, and
Yeah,
I'm not on Twitter, kind of. So I
yeah,
was like amazed by this, and then when I hopped onto Twitter and was checking everything out. But I always,
right,
I mean, whatever in my limited experience, I always tell
right,
writers to engage with their readers online so that they know
right,
what they require. Also, I mean, it's
correct, yeah, yeah,
all
yeah, yeah,
good to
yeah.
perhaps come up with a tome which nobody reads, but
Right.
understanding the audience. So
Oh yeah,
that,
yeah.
I mean, compliments to you because you understood your reader, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely. I think, and they've been giving me so as someone who posts my cooking and talks about food science all the time.
Yeah.
So the 60,000 or so people that who follow me on Twitter
Yeah.
have been giving me this kind of constant feedback all the time. So clearly, it was still, quite heartwarming that they still were surprised that the book was this useful to them.
Okay.
And so obviously I think of many of them who sort of over time engaged with me, and they would have bought my book simply because it's me and they've engaged with me, and they would have, to do me a favor and so on, and without necessarily expecting the book to be, so game changing for them and so on, right? And people somehow also, I think, people have this tendency to think about cookbooks as a genre
Oh yes.
in a certain way, in that you're not actually expecting someone to read a cookbook from start to finish,
Yeah.
right? You expect them to turn the pages, look at the photos, pick a
Nobody
couple of
does that.
recipes,
Trust me.
and
Trust me.
that's the end of it, right?
Yeah.
And so this was like, people read it and they were like, oh, okay, man, okay, this makes sense. So let me finish it. And so people actually finished it in like one sitting,
Yeah.
and they were like, oh wow, okay, I learned more than I thought I might. Right. So I think a lot of people had that feeling
Yeah.
that, oh, I didn't expect that it would be filled with so
That's
much
interesting.
sort of information that made me go, oh, okay, now this makes
Yeah.
sense. Okay, now I know why that went wrong, and so on, right? So I think that was very, very heartwarming in terms
One
of the
review
reviews and the responses.
which really, one review or perhaps comment or feedback, whatever you call it, which was like, yeah, maybe this guy is correct. I could have done more, perhaps something like that.
So one there was definitely so there was one review one it definitely was expecting a glossary, saying that it would have been easier to revise some of these ideas and maybe get a little bit deeper
Okay.
into some of the things that you use and so on.
I don't
And
think
that person
that, but okay, that's fine.
anyway. So I think there was also, strangely enough, one person felt that I was repeating myself too many times, and the book could have been about 50 pages shorter. So
Okay.
that was actually one
Okay. But I
feedback.
think
But
so.
then but that's the nature of the internet, right? I mean, I think you will get all kinds of feedback.
Of course.
I think you
But
need to look at
I
it.
thought that it provided a kind of reminder to me that I
Yeah.
need to repeat this, because this book is also about repeatability.
Oh yeah,
You
absolutely.
need to do
Yes.
certain things
Yeah.
good again and
Yeah.
again, because only
Yes.
doing this once is not going to work, right? So
Yeah, exactly, right. So and clearly, so when as I was discussing with Penguin, right,
yeah,
we said that, look, regardless of the success of the book, right, we should aim to write if this is going to be the first book in the genre,
yeah,
it is going to be taken that seriously, regardless of how successful this book is
right,
and subsequent books by others. If they discover that this is an interesting space and other
right,
writers start to write in this space, and maybe people might write 1,000-page science books in the future and so on, but this will always be the first,
of course,
and in the sense that it has to be written in a way that it stands that test of time, right? See, unlike say when you write about, say, current affairs,
hmm,
the life of that book is only 5 years, 3-4 years,
true,
while that current affair is still relevant, right? Uh, this is universal. I mean, this is going to be true 20 years from
this
now.
is not going
Uh,
away.
exactly, right. So it had to be sort of written with that mindset. And again, so I really had to hold myself back even when I use some of the humor or any references, in that I didn't want to make a references to, say, 2020, or something temporal, which may not make sense, say, 10-15 years down the line and so on.
And I
So
felt
that was
you did that like ever so slightly. I mean, it was,
very, very slightly, right?
I think
Yeah.
COVID is mentioned like once perhaps
Correct.
in the
Yes.
entire
Right.
book.
I mean, that was, COVID's an elephant in the room. That's
Yeah,
not
but that
hard to
had to be done. That had to be
had
done.
to be there, right?
2020.
But yeah, I
But
mean, nothing in the sense that even if let's say 5 years down the line, uh, it's not going to be hard for me to revise this edition of the
yeah,
book, to take out few of those even very specific references,
yeah.
and so on, right? So
So
that was
you,
the
it
thought
was
process.
perhaps it was hard for you to keep the humorist in you away from writing
Exactly. So
this.
I did rewrite. So in fact, 30% of the time
Okay.
that it took me to write the book went into the first chapter, because the
Wow.
first chapter was the toughest one. Because others were like very specific. Like I'm speaking about
Yeah.
onions and browning. I'm speaking about acids. I'm speaking about very specific things, and that it's easier for me to research and nail it down and so on. Uh, the first chapter was challenging in the sense of what I had to leave out,
Yeah.
versus what I had to leave in,
Correct.
knowing fully well this really had to cover the basics. And it had to cover it in a reasonably universal way
Yeah.
that nobody feels left out, right? A rice eater, a wheat eater, a veggie eater, a vegetarian, non-vegetarian, whatever it is, that they have something that they can learn from this in a reasonably universal way without it being overwhelming, right? Because also, the first chapter, if the first chapter is your longest chapter,
Yeah.
then you have another problem, right? So in a sense so it had to be short,
Yeah.
and yet somehow kind of capture as many things that people might be interested in,
Right.
so that so the longest chapter is actually, I think, the one which all with all the algorithms and so on,
Oh yes,
chapter 7, I think,
yeah, that's
right?
longest.
That took the least amount of time, right? So
But yeah, you talk about a lot of reactions, and Mallard reaction is mentioned multiple
yeah,
times.
reaction, yes,
And
yes,
at first, I was scared. What is this? What's going to happen in this? And it
yeah.
was like Dexter's laboratory for me. Uh, but when I reached it, I was like, okay, okay, This
Yeah.
is fine.
So it's basically so it's quite normal. Ask any grandma, anyone else. The magical color for food is brown. Okay.
Yeah,
So when food becomes brown, it becomes delicious,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But there's a fine line between brown and burning. Okay.
yeah.
And it's getting that balance
So
right.
what's the
And
tagline?
right. So the line, interestingly enough, this browning stuff
Yeah,
happens well above the boiling point of water. That's the key thing, right? So as long as you have anything with water, the temperature is never going to go above 100. Okay.
yeah,
Uh, so it's only when you do dry heat
yeah,
is when you start, or you put things in an oven, is when the temperature can go that high, right? To 200 Celsius, 150 Celsius, and so on, right?
yeah,
Or deep fry, right? Where you're using oil, which can heat itself up to 200 Celsius without smoking, right?
yeah,
So right, that's the Maillard reaction essentially is the series of reactions that makes food brown in color and absolutely delicious.
yeah,
So and as long as things are being cooked in water, they'll never get brown.
yeah,
So that's the basic insight, and that's the reason why restaurants, when they make any dish, bindi fry, you take whatever it is, right? The main ingredient is always browned separately
yeah,
and then added to the gravy.
yeah,
So they never, in a restaurant, will never cook everything in a single pot ever.
yeah,
So the thing that needs to be the most delicious will be browned separately and
yeah,
then added to the gravy at the end. So it has all the advantages
yeah.
of the
As
browning
simple as
reaction. That's
chicken
exactly
curry,
what.
perhaps.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
even you take anything, right?
yeah.
A restaurant always has a multi-step process. They take your main ingredient. It will
Okay.
be either deep fried or sautéed or whatever it is separately at high temperature
Hmm.
and then added to the gravy.
Yeah,
Because see, a gravy can never be high temperature because as long as water is around,
yeah,
it will remain under 100 Celsius.
right. Great
Which
talking to
goes
you.
back to understanding temperatures, right? So yeah,
Of course, it all boils down to that
yes,
temperature, and
yeah.
one needs to figure that out and read the book, guys. Of course, you can buy it off Amazon. Check out Krish's Twitter handles, website. The website has got loads of great content, so you can check that out as well. And I also see, Krish, that you have done the science thing in your background. Also, you have soundproofed yourself by yourself, I suppose.
Yes, yes.
So
No, so
that,
that's from all the music, right? So since I do,
oh, of course,
uh,
I completely
so
forgot.
I play the violin, guitar, and cello.
Yeah.
So and so this
Is
is
that
my
it?
home
Is that
studio,
it?
right? So
Is that it?
yeah, no. So violin is what I grew up playing, and then taught
Oh,
myself the guitar on YouTube, and
wonderful. And
cello again is
you'll find slight references here and there in the book also. But I'm also looking forward to a book on music from you. Of course, a sequel of this one. There might be. I don't know, but I love this
too
anyway.
early to say. Let's see how it goes, and
Let's
then
see.
that's
Uh,
it. Yeah.
yeah, great book. I mean, this was like perhaps a Tarantino movie. When you watch it for the first time, you're like, what the hell is happening? And what's going to happen? I felt that when I was watching Tenet recently, and can't say anything more. Thank you so much for talking to us. Okay, guys, pick it up. Tell Krish about it on Twitter or anywhere online. Leave a review on Amazon. Okay. Thank you so much, and a
Thank
huge
you so
shout
much.
out to Penguin for letting us do this, and of course for the book. Thank you so much.
Super.
Yeah.
All right.